Hello, I'm Andy Graham Larkin, Executive Director of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum. Welcome to Buffalo Soldiers in Bonita Canyon, 1885 through 1886. Why did they build that monument in honor of President James A. Garfield? With historian Sharon Kennedy. Thank you to our program sponsor, the Arizona Historical Society, as well as our members and donors who enable the museum to provide free online programming and fulfill the organization's mission to discover history, explore Bisbee's past today. To learn how you can assist the museum in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit bisbeemuseum.org. On Saturday, November 16th at 11 a.m., the museum will host the free online program Wicked Bisbee with author Francine Powers. To register or for more information, visit the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum Facebook page. And today and every Saturday at 2 p.m., the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum offers the Stepping Back in Time walking tour with former museum curator Boyd Nickel. During this 1-hour walking tour of the historic district, you will learn about the mining camp's rich history. Spaces are limited and reservations are highly recommended. To reserve your space, visit bisbeemuseum.org. Okay. Sharon Kennedy is an independent researcher, author, and freelance writer. She writes true stories about ordinary people and popular history and has a particular interest in researching Black history and pioneer women. Prior to retirement, she practiced law and worked for 20 years at 3 Midwest community colleges. She is from Detroit and has owned a home in Sahuarita, Arizona since 2005. She is a member of the Cochise County Historical Society and was the keynote speaker in February at the centennial celebration of the Chiricahua National Monument. And if you would like to ask any questions during the program today, please type your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll gather those at the end of our program and share them with our speaker. Also, a link of the recording of today's program will be sent to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, I'd like to welcome you, Sharon Kennedy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Annie, thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here, and thank you for those in the audience, and thank you for your interest in the Buffalo Soldiers. I think this topic is vitally important, and I'm glad you're here. So this presentation includes a slice of military, Buffalo Soldier, homesteader, and regional art history, which is where I began. I start with this artist's work because he is the only artist in the last 50 years in the Tucson area who depicted Buffalo Soldiers outside of the renowned artist Bob Vann, an African-American artist whose work is shown at the Pentagon, Fort Leavenworth, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This is Tucson artist David Laughlin, who 100 years after the Buffalo Soldiers arrived in the Arizona Territory, artist David Laughlin of Tucson began to research their presence in the area. He learned of their existence through his interest in the painting technique of well-known Western artist Frederick Remington. Remington, after being hired by Harper's Weekly, rode with the soldiers in the Arizona Territory on a few occasions and sent his work back east. 40 years after Laughlin began his research, I arrived in the Tucson area. I didn't notice many Black faces, and coming from the Midwest urban areas of Detroit and Chicago, the absence of Black faces was noticeable to me. I asked a simple question: what is the history of Blacks in this area? The answer was the Buffalo Soldiers were here, starting with the Apache Wars in the 1870s. And this is how my research journey began. Unfortunately for me, David died in 2020, and I did not learn of his work until 2021. A series of prints called Military Hours had become part of a new memorial to the Buffalo Soldiers in Tucson. When I saw the work, I inquired about possibly purchasing a print, and given the contact information for his daughter, still living in the Tucson area. I went to meet her and asked about purchasing a print. She indicated that I could and inquired whether I knew her father had done 15 years of research on the Buffalo Soldiers. I had no idea. She allowed me to search through his 10 banker boxes, and when I delved into the research, I saw drawings of the Buffalo Soldiers in Bonita Canyon and one of the Garfield Monument. I was then on my way to the Chiricahua National Monument to talk about this history with a park ranger. And I'm going to go back to the first slide. Artist Laughlin, accustomed to doing renderings for architectural firms in Chicago, he painted landscapes and created sculptures, but he was not accustomed to doing bodies. So in the 1980s, he hired a Black man in Tucson, Michael Ray Davis, to serve as his model when painting a soldier. And this is Michael. This painting and the accompanying notes I found in David's research were very interesting. And I found it quite amusing that this paid model complained profusely about having to wear this heavy wool uniform for so long during the month of July in Tucson. And I know all of you in the audience can appreciate this. But I think his reason for doing this to accurately reflect Laughlin's desire to get the features right is admirable. There has been in the past some criticisms about the way people painted Blacks and exaggerated their features. I think this shows what, first of all, what the Buffalo Soldiers would have been wearing in the Bonita Canyon. And his facial features are pretty accurate. So this is my favorite of David's paintings. It's called Morning Scout. And the reason I include it in my presentation is because I think this accurately depicts what the Buffalo Soldiers would have been doing on their way to Bonita Canyon. I think this landscape is very accurate based on what I've seen. So you would have had the captain in front. This would have been Charles L. Cooper. Behind him, you have two Indian Scouts. Indian Scouts rode with all of the troops. And the Indian Scouts, I was to find out, would always wear red headbands because they needed to distinguish themselves from other Native Americans. And they needed to make sure that they weren't going to be exposed to friendly fire. So they had the red headbands. So when I do this presentation, I never know how much people in the audience know about Buffalo Soldiers. So I do some general, share some general facts with you. If this is all thing, if you know all of this already, I apologize to you. So about half of the Black men who joined the regular Army in the late 1860s had served in the Civil War. 500 transferred directly from the United States colored troop regiments that they had served in prior to 1866. After the Army Reorganization Act was signed in 1866, these men were seasoned veterans who helped to offset the shortage of educated Black men in the ranks of the new regiments, and they furnished experienced comrades for recruits fresh from their civilian life. And the men here refer to themselves as colored men. And one of the issues that the War Department struggled with initially in creating during the Army Reorganization Act was where are we going to get educated men to serve ranks within the Army in terms of sergeants. So many of the number of the soldiers who were in Bonita Canyon were older by a decade. And they were highly respected by the fairly new recruits. So this worked well. So people ask me this all the time. The soldiers themselves, the enlistees were all Black. The officers, for the most part, were all white, although we're going to talk today about the first Black graduate of West Point. They were assigned initially to help with Western expansion. And of course, this is where all the Indian Wars activity started. They were, of course, engaged in military battles, and then subsequently they protected the Texas border during all the Mexican insurgencies. And eventually they served in other wars, Spanish-American War and World War I and II and others. What most people don't know is that the Buffalo Soldiers served as our national first park rangers, kind of unofficially, because when Teddy Roosevelt created the national parks, starting with Sequoia and Yosemite, the Congress did not create any enforcement people to keep people from building on the land and poaching animals. So the Buffalo Soldiers were sent into Yosemite and Sequoia and served those roles. But today we're going to be discussing the Buffalo Soldiers who were just assigned to southeastern Arizona. So where did the name come from? And this has been over the years a point of contention, but I don't think it is today, but over the years it has. And initially, people thought that they would that they were given this name by the Apache, not the Apaches, by the Comanches, and in the Oklahoma Territory. And it is believed that at least this is one theory, when the Native Americans saw Blacks for the first time, they thought that their tight hair looked like the fur between the horns on a buffalo. Now, if you know anything about the West and the history of the West, you know how important the buffalo was to Native Americans. They could not have survived without the buffaloes. But Black soldiers proved themselves to be very fierce fighters. And most of the research, almost, I would say 99% of the research that I used for my book indicated that the Native Americans used the term Buffalo Soldier as a term of respect because they revered the buffaloes. But initially, there was lots of different theories about why this name was used. And you should know that the Buffalo Soldiers themselves, of course, at the time did not know about this name. They were not, when they first learned about it, which would have been 1900 or thereafter, they were not particularly pleased. But over time, they accepted the buffalo as a fierce fighter like themselves. And the buffalo is now part of the insignia of the 10th Cavalry. So I include maps here because I give this presentation to people who may not know the area well. Maybe all of you are familiar with where Bonita Canyon is. It is in the Chiricahua Mountains and very close to the Mexican border and the New Mexico border. So in May of 1885, as the introduction indicated, the troops, the 10th Cavalry, was ordered into the Arizona Territory from Texas. And they got here in May 1st. And then in the fall, they were ordered to leave for Bonita Canyon to set up a temporary camp in the Chiricahua Mountains. And they stayed there until May of 1886. This was part of what was known as the Waterhole Campaign. The Colonel Commander Crook in the Arizona Territory decided to set up, while Geronimo was in the mountains in Mexico, he set up a line of troops around the water holes, rivers, or different water areas, so that if Geronimo came back in this direction, that they would not have access to the water for their horses or for their people. And I also include this particular photo because although many of you who were born and raised in the area maybe know this area well, as someone from the Midwest, I was just taken with the Chiricahuas and the Hoodoos, the formation, the rock formations. But understand that this area had been Apache land for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and they knew this area well, which was, what was presenting problems for those who weren't Apaches. It was a very rugged, remote area, but I think the area is stunning in its beauty. And I also included this particular map that was done by Bert Cohen to show you where the camp in Bonita Canyon was. The second arrow is Skeleton Canyon, which is, if you know anything about Apache history, this is where Geronimo ended up surrendering in September of 1886. It's on the other side of the mountains. It really over 100 miles and in very rugged territory. But Geronimo had in fact gone into the mountains in Mexico and then came back and into what is now southern Arizona. So this is the first rendering that David Laughlin did. It's his first line drawing of the soldiers' camp, based on all his years of research. An archaeological study was done of this area in 1983 when the National Park Service took over the property. And the report from that study outlines in great detail what the camp must have looked like based on the survey's findings. Many artifacts were found, which confirmed where certain parts of the camp were located. There is controversy among researchers about whether this chimney would have been part of the tents. Usually in a temporary encampment, there would not be such a structure. But this was not really a temporary encampment in the traditional military sense, because they were in the camp for 7 months, not 7 weeks. So it's possible the chimney was built. And certainly the soldiers were accustomed to using rocks and stones to build things, as you will see. So you can see in the back, there was stables for the horses. And there, as of January of 86, Troop E came into the area. So there were 2 troops. And that would have been, up to 100, 125, 130 people plus horses. And at one point there was more horses than people. So this is James Garfield. And this is such an interesting part of the story, I think. When I went to talk to a park ranger about the buffalo soldiers in Bonita Canyon, she indicated that they had, yes, they had built a monument to this man. And I was shocked. Honestly, I am not a historian by training. I did not know that much about Garfield. And so, of course, I was out to find out. A significant part of my research was to find out who this man was. And so let me tell you a little about him. James Garfield was a deeply, deeply religious man, and he was born into the Disciples of Christ Church in Northeast Ohio. And he was born to a farm family that was born into poverty. That was a farm family, but thrown into poverty when Mr. Garfield died. His mother wanted him to be educated. And so she and her older son saved $17 for him to attend school. He attended what would be now high school and post-secondary education. And when he did so, he ran into the issue of slavery. And early on in his religious, his religion guided his belief that slavery was wrong. Eventually, after his education, he was asked to run for office in Ohio, which he did. He was pretty much a radical abolitionist as a young man. And then there was a new congressional seat that was created in Northeast Ohio. And he was elected to that. And he did take his seat in Congress during the Civil War. Now, he also served in the Civil War, but President Lincoln asked him to come back and serve in Congress because he knew he was going to need people like Garfield in order to pass legislation. But Garfield gave impassioned speeches on civil rights for Blacks, voting rights, and the importance of education. And he was very instrumental in the passage of what we now know as the Reconstruction Amendments, which would be the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Unfortunately, he didn't run, he was asked to run for president. He was a reluctant president because it took 32 ballots. He came to the convention, the Republican convention, to support somebody else. And after 30 plus ballots, there was no consensus. His name was thrown in the hopper and he became the candidate for the Republican ticket. He took office as president in March. And in July, he was shot by a mentally ill man. And he lingered for 4 months and died in September of 1881. And so he probably, one of the reasons we don't know much about him, he didn't serve as president, but he had 16 years in Congress. And lucky for us that Garfield kept a diary. He wrote in it daily. And so we could tell his thinking on different things. And we were able, when I say we, I'm talking about the researchers at the James A. Garfield Historic Home in Metro, Ohio, where I have been twice, and I've presented there about the Garfield Monument. But lucky for us that he kept such good notes, and we were able to find out, I was able to find out exactly who this man was. And in my book, which you'll have a link to, I compared him. I asked the question of myself, was he basically the second coming of an Abraham Lincoln? And so in my book, I compared him to Lincoln. So this is the second. This is the second Laughlin rendering. This is, in fact, pretty close to what the Garfield monument looked like. Now, you're looking at the south side of it. On the north side would be the stones with many engravings. Garfield's large stone, a 2x3 stone, is in the middle of the second layer here. And then all of the other stones have the Buffalo soldiers carved their names, they carved insignias from their civilian life. And it kind of tells a story, I think, about who they were in their civilian life and who they honored. It's quite a remarkable, it was originally quite a remarkable structure. And we actually have two people who saw the monument when and talked about really the intricacies with which this monument was built. Now, the monument started to disintegrate, as you might expect, at the elevation in the Chiricahua Mountains, which I think it was, about 6,000, 7,000 feet. The weather started wearing. And the photo on the left is of an unidentified Black man. And there's another researcher and I who tried mightily to figure out who this was. We don't know who took this photo. But between 1890 and 1900, you can see it's still a fairly tall monument. We can speculate that this man could possibly be Sergeant George Horton, who tried mightily to get the United States Army to preserve this monument years after he left the service. The Army did respond by sending someone to look at the remains of the structure. But they reported back to their superiors that it looked like a remnant of a Sibley bake oven. So they weren't interested. Also, the Garfield family was contacted in sometime during the 1890s, and there is no record if they were. It would have been after Garfield's assassination. They were back in Mentor, Ohio, from having left the White House, and they were busy building, which is, I think, kind of ironic. They were building a library. Garfield library attached to their farm home. Garfield just read constantly. But it isn't clear from the records, whether they responded at all. On the right side, you can see a little of the larger stone, Garfield stone, in the middle. And you can see some of the carvings, but we'll see them up close. That the soldiers did on the stones around him, around the Garfield stone. And this is the north side of the monument in about 1910. And we don't know who took this photo. So this last close-up in the 1920s shows, you can see the monument. There has been some effort to protect what was left of the monument. You can see we have a wire fence that was installed. You can see there is a flagpole still sticking out of the monument. This fence would have been along a road that was built because there had been extensive vandalism of the monument, and this had to be the effort to preserve the monument. Now, this is a little higher elevation. You can see what was left of the monument back in 1926. You see that the stones are all around the bottom of it. And I think this monument, not the monument, but the stones in the monument will get a second life, which we're going to see in a minute. But I like this photo because a little bit in the back, I don't know if you can see, there's some white, looks like there might be some structures among the trees in the back. And that would be what became the Faraway Ranch, which is the Ericksons, who were Swedish settlers, the second generation of Erickson Riggs people, expanded on a structure that was originally there. The Ericksons moved into the area really three years after the Buffalo Soldiers left. They had a small baby, Lillian, and Neil Erickson started building. So we will see the Faraway Ranch in a minute, but the Erickson daughters actually started a guest ranch in that building. So these are some of the stones. Some of them are more elaborate than others. Obviously, some of the soldiers who carved these stones, some of them took more time. The one in the bottom in the middle was Logan, first sergeant, because the officers who were the ones who had been in the United States Colored Troops served, as I said, as sergeants, non-commissioned sergeants. And it looks here like the first sergeant, Logan was a first sergeant, and so he carved his rank on the stone. Now, the other one that I'm interested in, and I include this in my book, is Michael William Finnegan at the top with the 3 interlocking circles. Now, I was interested, in addition to asking why would they build a monument to Garfield, the second question was, were there any soldiers here from Detroit, since that is my hometown? And there were. And Michael William Finnegan was one of them. And so he actually carved 3 stones. This is one is the most elaborate. And the 3 interlocking stones are the symbol for the Oddfellows, and which tells you that he and maybe others in the group were members of chapters, the black chapters of the Oddfellows, because of course they weren't allowed to be in the white chapters. They had to get their charter from England. And their group is the Grand United Order of Oddfellows. So this tells us that they had civilian groups that they were affiliated with. Now, this is the mystery stone, H.O. Flipper. This is, Flipper was the first Black graduate of West Point. Looks pretty distinguished in this photo. Born into slavery in Georgia. He was the first Black graduate of West Point, but not the first attendee. He was the first Black to make it through West Point because it was that tough going. But he made it through in 1877 and came to the southern, and came to Fort Davis in Texas. He, and the other white officers were not appreciative of his presence. That's probably an understatement. They didn't want him there. He had to live with somebody else at the fort. And they, according to some civilian employees, he was made, he was a sergeant, lieutenant over the commissary, a quartermaster's office. And according to some of the civilians that worked there, they overheard that the white officers were going to find a way to get rid of him. And so lo and behold, money showed up missing. And he was court-martialed. Now he made the mistake, and he admits that he made the mistake of lying to his commander about what happened to the money. he didn't know what happened to the money, and to this day, nobody knows what happened to that money. But he was court-martialed and he was acquitted of the embezzlement charge, but still found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer for lying to his commanding officer. Now, and then he was dishonorably discharged, which is where the contention, bone of contention comes in, because there, in the history of the military up to this point, no white officer who had been found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer had been dishonorably discharged. In fact, the chair of the court-martial panel had recommended a reprimand, but the other officers on that panel dishonorably discharged him. Now, this was changed after his death. He died in the 1930s, and then the War Department, Bureau of Corrections, changed his dishonorable discharge to honorable after they reviewed the record. And then President Clinton pardoned him. But at the time of the honorable discharge change, his body was taken to a cemetery in Thomasville, Georgia, close to his home, and he had a military funeral there. He was quite a talented man in West Point. He studied engineering and law, and he knew fluent Spanish and French, which is how the rest of his life he pretty much functioned as a civil engineer, and was in the area of southern Arizona and worked for mining companies in Mexico. So he could have been in the area, but it's pure speculation because we don't have any proof of him being in the area. But his story is a sad one, but also for purposes of this presentation, a curiosity. So this is where the stones of the Garfield Monument got a second home. You can see in memory the large Garfield stone over the mantelpiece, and what it looks like 100. This is actually this stone on the left, Garfield stone. I believe I took maybe last year, a year before. This is what's 140 years later. This is what the stone looks like. J. Rousey is underneath the mantelpiece, and Flipper Stone is next to Rousey at the end of the first row under the mantle. That's the stones that were rectangular as opposed to square. This is the new guest dining room that was built to accommodate more guests at the Faraway Ranch. And so between Lillian Erickson Riggs' husband and Neil, they were able to build this fireplace. There are 48 stones in this fireplace, and outside there were more stones than there were places for them. And outside there's another 12 on the outside chimney, which you can see from the outside. If you're walking in the area, you would be able to see all of the stones that have engravings on them. And this is what it looks like today. Now, there have been tours in the past. They have been shut down for 2 years because they're doing asbestos abatement, but I believe they're getting ready to open this Faraway Ranch up to more tours. Let's see. So we're looking at the west side of the Faraway Ranch. And it no longer is a pink color. I was there in February, and they've done some improvements on the structure, and it's kind of an off-white now. But still looks basically like this. And where the stairs are is where Captain Charles Cooper and his wife and daughter were with him in Bonita Canyon. which is unusual. But again, this was a 7-month temporary encampment, not 7 weeks. And he was given permission to have his family there. So it was a two-room cabin. And the reason we know more about the Bonita Canyon event is because Forrestine Cooper became an author. How lucky can you get? We're going to show, I have a copy of her book called The Child of the Fighting Tent. It's old, it's 20 years old now, but she became a famous novelist, wrote children's books. One of them is called When Geronimo Rode. And so she talked about her experience here. And she talks about actually Michael Finnegan, my Detroit person, who was her bodyguard while she did horseback riding in the canyon here. And that story is a part of this Child of the Fighting Tent. And this is actually what it looks like today. I have many friends here where I live in Sarita who go camping, who have been to Chiricahua, but they always ask me, well, where's the faraway ranch? You know, if you come into the park and keep going and get to the visitor center, you've passed it. The signage is not very good, but hopefully we can send more people there. And I'll tell you about an event that's going to happen soon. So after the Buffalo Soldiers left in May of 1886, I would ask people, were there other Black families in the area after the Buffalo Soldiers left? There were not other military units in the area. And Fort Huachuca, the first Black unit, came in 1893. And but the tent didn't arrive until a little later. So there weren't other military units in the area, but in terms of non-soldiers, settlers. In Graham County, which is a small village called, of all things, Bonita, a Black family was creating their own homestead. And around the time that the Buffalo Soldiers were in Bonita Canyon. And as luck would have it, they eventually came to work at the faraway ranch. And so this is the second generation of the third generation of the Martin family. In 1935, Lillian came to work at the faraway ranch. Now, the Martins had a very successful ranch. They had over 600 acres, and they had a dairy. They had dairy cows, and they had cattle. And but when the Depression hit, they struggled to hold on, which not unusual. And so they moved to Wilcox, where they had been selling some of their dairy products, and then they were looking for work, and they worked at various ranches. And the men in the family were quite accomplished cowboys and cattle ranchers. So Jesse came to work at the faraway ranch, which was then the Guest Ranch in 1935. So when I was looking through, and this is what happens to research, I was looking for just different books that talked about the faraway ranch. This one could have actually been at the Arizona Historical Museum. And I saw this photo of this Black woman serving people at the faraway ranch. And of course, who is this? So her name is Legesa. And she came from Louisiana with her mother. She's quite young. I mean, she's a teenager there, not as old as Jesse. but she became Jesse's sister-in-law and came to work to help Jesse in the kitchen and a server. She came with her mother. And what's wonderful for me is that there are descendants of the Martins in the Tucson area. And so one of whom has extensive photos of the family over the years. And this is very helpful to me. So I'm not sure her mother, I asked why would her mother, why would they come? I believe they came from Texas. Things were not, maybe the work wasn't there or the hostility was too much for them at the time. And they came into this area to work. So this is the Martin, these are the Martins and the Reeks, actually. Johnny and William Garfield Jr. Came to work for the ranch. In fact, William Martin, in the middle, became the foreman of the ranch. So they were highly respected for their work, and Lillian, they trusted them to run their ranch, which is what they did because Edwin was not a rancher. He was a carpenter, but he wasn't a rancher. So I found this, I was able through my contacts with the descendants, the Martin descendants, to find, this is kind of a composite photo of Johnny, William Garfield, and then James. They all served in the military and, you know, and carried on the tradition of military service that the Buffalo Soldiers had started. The other thing I found very interesting, and I have, I talk about this in my book, is that since the first children in the Martin family, the first boys in the Martin family were born back in the late 1880s, there has always been one male that had the middle name Garfield, and I was struck by that. And they didn't just discontinue it at 140 years later. The most recent son, Garfield, with the Garfield middle name, is in California, is pretty young. I think might be a toddler now. So many generations of the Martins have included the Garfield name. And I just thought that was, call it what you want, coincidental. But I was taken by the fact that there are still and will continue to be well into the future Martin men who take, I think, as a tribute to Garfield, to take the middle name of Garfield. Now, what about today? In conclusion, I am struck by the relevancy of Garfield's congressional speeches, actually. When you look at how long ago all of this happened, there are still topics that are certainly germane today in terms of civil rights, voting rights, education. And one that is not, most people don't know, was as a result of Garfield's assassination. There was an effort to bring in civil service because the person who shot at Garfield had been at the White House a number of times trying to get a job, which is how people got jobs with the administration. They came to the White House, they stood in line. And he had been there more than once because Garfield recognized him. But he was mentally ill, and he thought he deserved to have a cabinet position in Garfield's cabinet. So the issue of civil service today is germane to in our public discourse, and I find that pretty interesting too. So speaking of Garfield, there is a book that was written, and it's 10 years old. called The Destiny of the Republic. And I can show you these once we get back on a different screen, but there is a Netflix docuseries in the works about the Garfield assassination, and it's called Death by Lightning. And I don't think we'll see it, honestly, if it's the end of 2025, maybe 26. But it's mostly about the assassination and what happened to him in these 4 months between him getting shot and dying. And because this was a time where there was no germ theory, and no fewer than 10 doctors put their hands without gloves into Garfield's body trying to find that bullet. And he ended up dying from foreign bacteria. So I think that will be part of the docuseries. I don't have Netflix myself, but I will get it. I understand you can get it temporarily. And finally, my book, of Buffalo Soldiers and Bonita Canyon, is my first writing about this topic. But I think now I have made enough contacts with actually descendants of Buffalo soldiers in the area who talk about the next iteration of Buffalo soldiers who came to Fort Huachuca and then were sent to the Mexican border at the time to make sure that the Mexican insurgents were not carrying property or horses or cattle or anything else across the border. They were mainly to make sure the border was secure, interestingly enough. So I think there may be a second in a series called The Buffalo Soldiers at the Border. This would have been in the early 1900s. And I'd also like to do a little bit more on the Martin family, because you don't find so many generations that can tell you the story going back 140 years. And so I'm just grateful that I've had the opportunity to meet them, to spend time with them, and to help share the history of the Martin family. So that is my presentation. And
well, thank you so much, Sharon. And I can stop your sharing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
No problem. So you wanted to show us the books.
I do.
Show us those and tell us a little bit about them.
Thank you. Okay, the first book, Child of the Fighting Tenth, is Forestine Cooper Hooker. She ended up marrying a hooker, which is a name I'm sure all of you from the area are familiar with. Her story is a fascinating one. Literally, she was 7 to 9 months old when she started traveling with her father in the military. And so these the soldiers are not able to have their families. So she was a little tyke, and they became quite enamored with her. And she had a great experience with the Buffalo Soldiers. So this is the Child of the Fighting Tenth, and this is Candace Millard. Now, she has so many wonderful books. This is Destiny of the Republic, a tale of madness, medicine, and the murder of the president. And this is the book upon which the Netflix series will be based. And if you want to know about Garfield, this is the book to get. And it starts, of course, tells you about his childhood and his adult life, and then right up until his death. So that's it.
And would you tell us again the title of your current book and where to find it in the event someone is watching this on YouTube in a few months from now?
Sure. The title is Buffalo Soldiers in Bonita Canyon, Who They Were and Who They Mourned James A. Garfield. And it's on Amazon. And it will be also, there will be copies after next week with the Camp Naco Alliance on their website. And so far that's where the book is available.
Perfect. And in a modern context, where was the monument? Is it about where the faraway ranch parking area is?
Yes. Yes, it is, because the area looks nothing like it would have been back there. And so you almost you know, I think it was even farther west. Forrestine, when she writes about being in that canyon, she writes about, their cabin, which would have been the faraway ranch, being, 500 yards away. So it's a good little distance, but it would have been in what I call it looks like a parade ground. It was actually a valley, just looks like a valley to me um, with no growth on it. And this is, I think, where they would have practiced their mounting and dismounting and whatever other maneuvers they were doing. So it would be it is where all of the parking is now. Well, we know exactly where it is because the second archaeological dig was determined to see whether they could find the foundation of the monument, and they did find it.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
And what, if anything, do you think reusing the stones, particularly those of the Buffalo soldiers, in a place of prominence in their home, to you, what does that say about the Riggs family?
In my dedication, I dedicate the book to a couple different people. One of them was Suzanne Moody, a park ranger, who just helped me immensely with the research. But the Riggs, I also dedicate the book to them. And I'm sorry I haven't had an opportunity to meet any of the descendants. But here's my thinking. Had they not taken those stones indoors, we would not be having this discussion, I don't think, about the Garfield Monument. I think getting them out of the elements preserved those stones. And actually, for given 140 years, I think, you can still see the engravings. And if I get a chance to meet any of the descendants, the Riggs descendants, I am going to thank them on behalf of me and anybody else who hears this story, because I don't think we would have this story without the Riggs.
Agreed. And I just think it's fabulous that they also kept the stones with the Buffalo soldiers' names, again, in a place of prominence within their
Yes.
home, a
Yes.
main focal point, a gathering place.
Yeah, who would have thought that? I mean, they were Swedish. There was only about 4 different settlers in the area at the time. Swedish settlers, and Lillian, she remembers playing around the monument. She, as a child, and who would have thought? I mean, who would have thought that they thought it was that important that these stones come inside? So I'm just eternally grateful.
And in closing, why don't you tell us what you're currently researching, if anything, or if you might be taking a break?
Well, here's what happens, I think, with a lot of, well, I could speak for myself, but I know other writers who have finished books. I do, right now, I'm just kind of setting up some book events. And while I'm doing that all the time, this is what happens with your brain. It's always working to say, okay, what about this? I have ideas. I need to narrow down the ideas. what's interesting to me is, like I said, the Martin family, who at the exact time that the Buffalo Soldiers were here, they were setting up their own, ranch. But I think I will do something more on the Buffalo Soldiers along the border. At camp, this would include the Buffalo Soldiers along the border, starting in 1913, I believe, were around Arivaca, Nogales, Camp Naco, and there was a Camp Jones in Douglas. So those would be the 4 areas that I would be doing research. And but I think the women in the Martin, let me just say this about women in the Martin family. Daisy, they came here with, Daisy was the matriarch of the Martin family, and she came with an officer to Fort Grant from Nashville. She came as a nanny or a housekeeper, and to take care of Officer Allison's children. And this is where Mr. Martin, Caleb Baines Martin, met her. At the point after the children got a little older, she didn't like ranching that much, and she went to California. Unfortunately, she went to San Francisco and died in the earthquake. I think research, if there is any available, on that issue would be very interesting to try and find her. But then her daughter-in-law, Rena Selden, came from, no, I'm sorry, Daisy came not from Nashville. Her daughter-in-law came from Nashville and actually was an educated woman. Her mother had died during childbirth, and Mrs. Allison had said that she would raise Rena, which she did. And she was, I think, probably the first alum of Fisk, of a historically Black college, who arrived in the Arizona Territory. So she was educated, and she homeschooled her children and fought to have her children be educated beyond 5th grade. So I think the women in the Martin family are very interesting, and I may decide to do that. I need to narrow down. That's always the issue. I have lots of ideas, but I need to narrow it down.
Oh, well, that's completely understandable. Lots of rabbit holes to go
Yeah,
down.
yeah, exactly.
Sharon, thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with our audience today.
Okay, thank you, Annie.
And thank you to our audience for joining us. And we hope that you'll join us again for our next online program on Saturday, November 16th. Goodbye, everyone.